Hi, and welcome to Spin Nation, the podcast that looks at the data behind the spin to reveal the forces shaping Canadians' perspectives. I'm your host, Laurel Osfield. Hello to my co host, Emmanuel Case.
Hi, Laurel. Good to be with you today.
So, today we're going to break down a discussion about the pipelines. Now, you actually have some experience working in the energy sector, don't you?
Yes, I worked 4 or 5 years in energy procurement, both electricity and natural gas for Ontario businesses.
And when I was living in China, I worked in the infrastructure sector in Asia. So we both have some personal connection to this industry. But today, we're going to use some of our own data. In the first couple episodes, we were using other data from other companies. This time, we've done our own analysis, and we're going to break down the discussion about pipelines and the perspectives about pipelines. But really, I think the two main narratives that come through are around climate change and the economy.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing because pipelines were really a back burner issue for the last couple of years, but things really exploded right after the Trump election.
So the question that we asked ourselves is what's behind what we were seeing as a very drastic shift in perspective amongst Canadians about pipelines? Where if you went back a few years, pipelines were bad. Right? This is fossil fuels, this is climate change, and we should not be doing pipelines. That has really shifted. Pipelines are now seem to be the savior of the Canadian economy.
Yeah, it's been a big reversal. And what's really interesting is that it's an issue that had almost been seen and perceived as settled following, the Paris Agreement in 2019, and I think the first COP conference in 2022. And everybody was going merrily along with decarbonizing the energy economy, but we noticed in a pattern where things started shifting in 2023, and interest in regaining control of the narrative uh, by a lot of the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, so I mean, COP goes back further than 2022, but this is sort of a data pull that we wanted to look at. And you, what we thought was really interesting, we're going to put this data up right now, is pipelines, what you're saying, they were sort of below the radar and people were not talking about them for quite a couple of years until Trump got elected. And that was kind of that first inflection point. What is really quite stark if you compare, let's compare equal time frames. So if you look at Q1 2024, not much talking about pipelines. But then you look at that to Q1 2025, and if you look at this as a combined view of social media and news, that coverage served 560%. I mean, that's pretty significant.
That is incredible in terms of, again, an issue that many had thought had been settled, but coming back to the fore. And I think the shift is even stronger when you look at discussions of pipelines in the context of developing the economy. That went up 12 times. And then when it comes to, no, sorry, it came up 30 times. And the environmental conversation around the pipelines, that went up 12 times.
So you're really seeing this idea that pipelines and the economy are very interlinked in the Canadian mindset right now. So then the next question is who's behind that?
Yes, and no surprise, what we see is Alberta and a lot of the Alberta and Western politicians using that to their advantage in the Canadian election.
Right. And so we wanted to look at just from a geographic point of view, you're saying Alberta had about 45% of the share of voice around pipelines. And we looked at that from a year like May 2024 to May 2025. So for sure, Alberta is out front at driving this narrative. No big surprise. Danielle Smith is the number one spokesperson when it comes to trying to push this. Pierre Poilievre also is up there, but Danielle Smith, if she wants to say that she's put pipelines back on the map, I think she can claim success in that space.
Yeah, certainly. She was able to bring it back to the fore, to everybody's attention. And we contrast that with Quebec being the second most mentioned province when it comes to pipelines. So probably a combination of being seen as a possible obstacle to the east-west pipeline development. But also there was a lot of conversation during the election where the possibility of building that pipeline was thawing in people's mind and seeing it as a way to rebuild our economy in the face of a very aggressive Trump trade policy.
So definitely Trump played a role. I think he played a role in this shift. Obviously, Danielle Smith is the champion here, but Trump globally, I would say, started to make it okay for those who, let's just say, maybe they're not necessarily climate deniers, but felt that the economic benefits or importance of the oil and gas sector, with it, let's say globally overall, the way that Trump positioned it, it started making it okay to support oil and gas. Whereas I think before, if you talked about fossil fuels, you're a climate denier, you're getting canceled, you're a terrible person. He shifted that narrative, and I think we have to give him credit. And Danielle Smith was really there to push it. You're talking about Quebec. They've been historically fairly anti-pipeline, but we're seeing, just in this last year in May, starting to soften on that stance and maybe be a little bit more open to potentially east-west pipeline. But that is not for sure. I think we might even see that shift again. But I think Quebecers have been a little bit more pro-climate, anti-LNG or anti-fossil fuels if we look at this from across the province.
Yeah, yeah. And, to be fair, for any pipeline build, it goes through the province, but doesn't necessarily land there and therefore might not bring, a ton of benefits in the long term. So it's a big ask for not necessarily a lot of returns.
The other voice I want to talk about, so as you said, it looks like the climate warriors, they are kind of losing this battle, this messaging battle right now within Canada. The outlier to that would be Indigenous voices. So if we look at their share of voice has been growing. I mean, not a huge, but they went from 12% when we looked at the end of 2024, so May to December. That grew to 16% in the first half of 2025. So they still have the ability, I mean, not just to talk about environmental protection, but Indigenous rights, Indigenous sovereignty. So that is still a voice to be reckoned with. People are paying attention and listening more than they were before, I would say, to what their role is to play in pipelines and where that ends up being in Canada.
Yes, they're definitely one of the voices that are going to have a huge influence on this whole debate. And I think another consideration that we need to have in Canada is the concept of brand Canada for the rest of the world. So we have Europe, which is still very inclined towards a lot of the ESG practices and improving our performance in terms of carbon footprint. So anything that we do in Canada to promote fossil fuel extraction is going to affect brand Canada in Europe at the same time as we're trying to build more trade with Europe. So this could become eventually an obstacle.
That's very true. And I think this is where I would lay some blame on the Trudeau government. So I did a pretty quick look, and the reason why they were moving towards what is being perceived as sort of the anti-fossil fuel, anti-Alberta, anti-pipeline legislation and regulation is, Canada did make commitments under the Paris Agreement. They're nationally determined contributions. They are committing to reduce emissions, and they needed to move forward on some policy changes to achieve that. But I would say they lost the narrative and lost the plot, especially when it came to some of these where they didn't do a very good job at messaging why. So they were making these changes, but the connecting to the why, that got lost. And we really didn't see much conversation. I did a very kind of sampling poll, and there's barely any discussion in Canada about the Paris Agreement. Like, it doesn't even register. But that was really kind of why. Like, Canada has to do its part. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that the Conservatives under Poilievre were incredibly effective at taking what some would consider to be smart net zero policies around the carbon tax and turning that into a bad thing. So when we actually looked at the entire conversation in Canada about pipelines and climate change, the number two term that comes up is the carbon tax. So the carbon tax came framed as a bad thing, that taking money away from, even though you got a check, but I think people didn't quite understand the policy behind that. Are they net ahead? Are they net behind? So that communication failure is, I would say, why we are seeing the oil and gas sector being so effective with support from the Conservative Party federally and provincially, are being very effective at having made this narrative shift.
Yeah, very effective slogan. Axe to tax, easy. It rolls off the tongue, and it works certainly at pocketbook issues. But I think in general, there's been a communication miss from internationally when it comes to the climate change efforts. In the early 2020s, there were a series of regulatory and political wins to change a lot of people's attitude towards fossil fuels and carbon and the environment. And the public was definitely in support of that. And so sentiment was really, really high in 2021, early 2022. Um, but the problem is that was only winning the beginning of the fight, because really that's where it becomes hard. Even though everybody's committed to reducing carbon, once it starts to move towards implementation, means that this is the hard part. We need to find compromises between different stakeholder groups. There are technologies that were speculative that still haven't been deployed at full scale. Some countries are winners, some countries are losers. So we need to find a compromise between all these different groups. And I think what happened is everybody celebrated the wins at the various COP conferences, but then all the bureaucrats needed to huddle together and talk it through and find all the numbers and fill in all of the implementation plans. And so everybody went away, and we stopped talking about climate. And I think the general public stopped caring about it because it was just so out of sight for multiple years.
And this is, I would say, probably Carney, maybe this could end up being his Achilles here, but Carney was very much traveling in those spaces that you're talking about. So, when I was working in international development, I mean, there was a big global community who work in multilateral development, international development. This is the UN systems, WTO, everything with the COP. There's a world there and an economy around that world where this was so front and center, and everyone was talking about it. There was huge pushes, as you said, and effective pushes at making this a priority for governments. And let's say some governments were able to take that back to their home countries and then reinforce why they were making certain changes. And I don't have any data to back this up at all, but I speculate that maybe Saudi Arabia is a good example of that, where they are a very heavy, obviously, fossil fuel country. MBS is made a ton of changes to their economy, to their culture, to their society to try to diversify the economy and set Saudi Arabia up for the future. But it seems like they've done a very good job. Like, okay, we're turning off the faucet on fossil fuels, or we know that it's not going to last forever. Let's focus on other avenues to diversify our economy. And that message seems to be landing well. And I can say, I don't know for sure, but from people I know who are living in the kingdom, is still well received. And these changes are being generally well received. I was saying in Canada, part of our NDCs or our nationally determined contributions would mean we'd have to move away to some degree from fossil fuels, which is what some of these Trudeau government initiatives were. Some of these bills that Carney's trying to stop that put caps on pipelines and extraction. But then what do you replace that with? So what do you replace the revenue with? And from an implementation point of view, I know they tried a bunch of things. Nothing really landed. So you've basically shutting off the taps, literally, figuratively, on a revenue generation, an economy builder, and you're not replacing it with anything. And doubling that, you kind of failed on communicating what it is you're trying to do at the same time. And hence, here we are now. Carney picking up that mantle, Carney having been at the forefront of all these global international discussions on climate, having been a huge champion for it, how is he going to navigate this now going forward where Canadians think pipelines are the answer?
Yeah. And that's what we saw. We did a number of analyses of angles of attack for against Carney and against Poilievre. But when it came to Carney, his association to UEF, the WEF, World Economic Forum, he was also called out as a globalist, and so this is some of the baggage, if you will, that he's going to have to carry forward. And for sure, these angles are going to be exploited over the next few months.
So I think there's still more to come on this pipeline discussion. Again, if the environmentalists want to bring this issue back to the forefront, they have an uphill battle. I would say right now, I think as you were saying, they were really winning in that public opinion space, and that they've lost some ground lately. I think it's going to be tough for them to fight back, at least while our economy is under stress.
Exactly. Until all these trade issues and governance issues are resolved, a lot of this is probably going to take the back burner.
So end state is right now, we're going to have oil and gas sector very much championing their industry. They have made great headway. We're going to see what happens, whether we end up getting more pipelines. Will Quebec block them? Still a TBD on that, though. While they do have some momentum in Quebec, that may not last for too long. And we know these pipelines can take a long time. But the climate warriors are going to need to find a way to make a personal connection somehow to Canadians about why they need to care. Maybe First Nations voices and Indigenous voices could be, I mean, I know they probably are already partnering with them, but they definitely have a lot more clout right now than environmentalists. So maybe we can see further partnership over there.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. It's essentially going to pit Alberta versus Quebec, I think, to a large degree, two provinces that have a strong voice in Canadian politics. And the federal government is going to be sort of stuck in between because there's only so much they could do to approve regulatory processes and whatnot. Somebody still has to say yes or no at the provincial level. So let's see if Carney is a good negotiator and moderator of that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, the other element of this is depending on how this goes and whether or not pipelines do start becoming built will likely be a factor into the whole separation conversation in Alberta. We have dug into that for since February. I think we started tracking the separation conversation in Alberta, picking up momentum, and Danielle Smith playing both sides in that. But I think if they don't see movement on the pipelines, they will try to use that as a way to further that separation issue within Alberta. So there's a lot kind of riding on it.
Would it be funny if Alberta threatens to separate if there's no pipeline, and then Quebec threatens to separate if there is a pipeline?
Yes, so welcome to Canada. Okay, well, super interesting to watch. I think this one brings in both of our historical backgrounds and the industries that we've worked with. And look, at our country's brand is on the line domestically and internationally. So we'll see how much Carney can walk this tightrope.
It'll be fun to watch.
All right. Well, if you like this conversation and you want more, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We are going to have more episodes. We're going to be looking at some of those cultural and societal issues that are shaping Canadians' views. So we will see you next time. Thank you.
Until next time.